Hello and welcome. I'm Melinda Crane in Berlin. On our agenda today, too hot to deny. Are Australia's bushfires sparking new thinking on climate change? It's time to talk. Australia's used to heat and drought, but this summer's been a veritable inferno. Record heat, raging bushfires, a country under climate siege revisits doubts about global warming. And grounded again. Will Berlin's new airport ever open its doors? It was supposed to go into operation in 2011, but Willy Brandt International Airport is delayed opening at least 4 times. Now authorities are saying it won't be ready until next year at a cost overrun of 100%. Whatever happened to German precision engineering? But precision football's making a comeback. The Bundesliga's on a roll. It's got winning players and eager new recruits, as well as the lowest ticket prices and highest average attendance of any of Europe's major leagues. What kicked off the change in the German league? And we've invited 3 people to join me here in the studio to talk about the stories on this week's agenda, starting with DW's own Titus Chalk. He is a freelance British sports journalist who reports for both German and British football publications, including 442 and the UEFA Champions League magazine. Titus, time was when British sportscasters loved to compare German football teams to vehicles. For example, the Panzer, the tank, ugly but effective, as it were. If you were to make such a metaphor today, what would be your vehicle of choice?
Well, I think I'd opt more for the VW Golf. It's a quintessential German brand, high quality, user-friendly, and very popular with export. I might just specify, though, one with a hybrid engine, because part of the Bundesliga's appeal is also its sustainability. Okay,
we're looking forward to hearing more about that. Our next guest is Armin Merz. He is an aerospace engineer who worked on the Berlin airport project at its very inception. He also has worked all over the world in conjunction with his company, the Merz Transport Consult. He's been involved in airport planning and development in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere. Mr. Merz, the Berlin airport project has become an absolute embarrassment. What's wrong, and whatever happened to that precision German engineering that was so vastly admired?
Well, I think there is not the fundamental problem with the German precision engineering, but there is rather a problem with the way in which it is being delivered and the management of the delivery of the same.
And I'm very pleased to welcome, in addition, the Australian ambassador to Germany, the Honorable Peter Tesch. He is a career Foreign Service officer who has served in New York, in Kazakhstan, and in Moscow. And he most recently acted as Commissioner General for Australia and Executive Director at the Shanghai World Expo in 2010. Ambassador, it's hard to imagine in the chilly German capital, but the fact is the record heat in your country is actually forcing meteorologists to reinvent their color charts and add new colors for the upper end of the scale. Is it also forcing a rethink on the part of the climate change skeptics in your country, who are rather numerous?
Well, you're not talking to a climate change skeptic, and that's both in my personal and professional capacity. I think people need to look around at what's happening in our country. The evidence is pretty clear.
The peak temperatures that have caught meteorologists by surprise are topping 50 degrees, and that is big trouble for one of the driest inhabited places on the planet. Experts, including an Australian government commission, say there can be no doubt that global warming is helping spark the bushfires that are raging across the country. But what to do about it is a sensitive topic in a country with a major mining industry and a massive CO2 footprint.
Australians are well used to summer heat. But this year, weather experts have added new color bands to their temperature charts, ready for peaks higher than 50 degrees Celsius. More than 100 bushfires are burning across the country, some of them out of control. That too is not new, but there is a worrying new volatility in the Australian climate. Recent years have also seen record floods. Australians generate more carbon pollution per head than any other developed country, and some are making the link with extreme weather. In 2012, the Australian government introduced a tax on polluting industries, which has been attacked as a job killer by the opposition. But taxes won't stop the heat or put out the fires.
Ambassador, at 50-plus degrees with those new bands on the meteorologist's color charts, it seems a bit absurd to still be arguing about the science of climate change, yet so many people in your country still are.
Well, I wouldn't overstate the numbers who are arguing about the science. I think, in fact, the government has made very clear its position. Climate change is real, and Australia needs to act. It needs to act domestically, and it needs to continue to act internationally, as we have done for the past few years, to play our part in not just contributing to some of the causes, but also being part of the solutions. And that's an area where we are working very closely with Germany and very, very effectively.
Does the ongoing debate have anything to do with the strength of your mining industry? After all, exports of coal, and it is, of course, one of the very dirtiest of the fossil fuels, exports of coal account for more than half of Australia's exports.
Well, certainly coal is our second largest commodity export. We are the largest coal exporter in the world, and because we've had abundant reserves of easily accessible coal, it's played a major role in our industrial makeup. But the government has made very, very clear we need to move away. We need to begin the transition to a low-carbon economy. That's what we're doing. The introduction of a carbon price, massive investments that government and industry are making in renewable energies signal that we are changing course. Our support for Kyoto 2, for example, our activism in regional and global climate change negotiations shows we recognise there is a challenge, we have to be part of it. And I think people in Australia, the broad community, recognises that. There is huge interest in renewable energies, huge interest in smart metering, huge interest in how we can improve our ability to adapt to the climate, which is undeniably changing around us.
You mentioned the carbon tax. Our report mentioned it as well. It could, of course, help start changing behavior, but for that it has to stay in place, and the opposition has talked about wanting to remove it. What kind of survival chances do you give that carbon tax?
Well, the second most dangerous thing for a public servant to do is to speculate about the political prospects in the country. We have an election this year. The opposition is on record as supporting the government's goal to reduce our CO2 emissions between 5 and 25%, depending on global movements in that direction. Whether the carbon price remains part of that solution, there is a lot that is being discussed at the moment. I think we need to wait and see what happens at the federal elections and what the reality is of both national and international circumstances.
Industry has been claiming that the cost of cutting carbon emissions is simply too high, particularly given the importance of mining for your country and given the fact that we're still in the midst of a financial crisis. But don't other costs have to be factored in? The raging bushfires, what is the cost of that for your economy?
Well, estimates vary, and if you look over the last few years at the nature and scale and intensity of these fires, the damage can be measured in the billions. The industry, of course, has been part of the negotiation of these measures. There are still people who will criticise whether a carbon levy is the right mechanism, whether there shouldn't be more investment in promoting renewable energies. The government is putting about $3 billion over the next few years into various renewable programs. But what we see, I think, is a very clear set of signals. The climate is changing. The extent to which that is a result of human activity may be debatable, but it is acting as a catalyst for Australians to say we need to do more. It is in our own self-interest. We see the barrier reef, we see agriculture, we see the bushfires in parts of the country that are traditionally not as badly afflicted as they are now, Tasmania, for example.
The fact is, though, of course, no one country acting alone can solve this problem. Are we also seeing in Australia what economists like to call the free rider problem, that people say, why should I do anything about this when our neighbours there in China are doing so little?
Well, I'd simply refer you to what you said earlier in this broadcast. The Australian government introduced a carbon price in July of last year. We have committed to a second protocol period for the Kyoto Protocol. These are moves that have been welcomed by the EU and by countries around the world as a very strong and important signal. Australia, a major industrialised economy, 13th largest economy in the world, 4th largest in Asia, is saying we have to act. And if we have to act, others need to act.
You talked about working together with Germany. Of course, you are now serving in a country that has gone in quite the opposite direction, that has made renewable energy something of a national mission. Do you have trouble explaining that to the folks at home?
No, not at all, because I think it parallels a trend, admittedly starting from a lower base and rather later in the piece, that we see in Australia very clearly. Our goal is similar to that of Germany, to double the share of renewable energies in contributing to our energy needs by 2020. Admittedly, at the moment, they make up a lesser percentage of our energy production model than in Germany, but that is our target. And the government has committed to reductions of CO2 emissions. We are, I think, very well on track, and there is a huge amount of understanding in Australia, and in fact it's one of the areas of greatest and most active collaboration, particularly in solar, also in wind. We have very, very good relationships with Fraunhofer, with the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organisation. These are themes that are very prominent, and indeed clean energy is one of the agreed 3 priority areas for our respective scientific collaboration.
Titus Chuck, I'd like to bring you in here and ask you, also coming from a different culture to Germany, has living here changed your attitude to things like environmental conservation and perhaps your personal habits in terms of turning out lights or machines?
Actually, in some respects it has. I actually feel quite proud to be living in a country which is happy to go its own way with the energy vendor and say, you know, this might not be anything short of a massive challenge to turn off nuclear and pursue renewables, but I think it's a really bold step. And having seen Peter Altmaier talk on the topic, I'm convinced that actually it's something that Germany can do, particularly if it brings to bear that precision engineering to the problem. And I think that would be a brilliant sign of leadership.
Peter Altmaier, of course, being the German environmental minister. I mean, Merz, do you worry as an engineer that we may already have gone past the tipping point on climate change?
It's difficult to say where we stand in that regard. But, I mean, if you're dealing with air transport, you of course also confront these issues. And there is a lot of blame also put on air transport in that regard. I think that it's difficult to say where we stand because we tend to think in terms of our own lifespan, but that's very negligible, essentially, in regard of the processes that are taking place. And we don't know what our contribution is to all this happening. Now, what I wonder is, well, we are talking about measures that we want to take against climate change and global warming. The question is, will this be effective, and will it help those people who are affected right now? How do they adapt? They are facing the problem right now, but the effects of the actions that we may take could materialize like a decade or 2 decades down the line. We've had the same situation with the ozone hole. We made changes, and it took like 2 or 3 decades to improve the situation. Does that help the people on the ground right now? So we have an immediate problem, but we're thinking about a long-term solution. How do we make that match up with each other?
Ambassador, brief last question to you. Do you worry that it could be too late? I mentioned earlier your country is the driest inhabited place on the planet. Are you concerned that perhaps there are places, regions in Australia that will simply have to be given up, as it were?
I think that might be overstating it. It's certainly true that we are going to have to adapt, and I think the Climate Commission, other scientific and analytical organisations point to measurable changes in the nature of our agriculture. In 20 years' time, will we be farming the crops we are farming in the regions of Australia that we currently farm in? That's perhaps open for debate. But we've spent 200 years adapting to one of the harshest climates in inhabited countries. We are going to face further challenges. We recognise that. There's nothing to be done but to get on with it. and I wouldn't be a doomsayer. I think we are seeing really palpable signs that the world and Australia recognise the time to act is now, and I don't think it's ever too late to start acting.
Are you seeing any migration yet within Australia? People saying, I'm not going back to that area, I'm not going to rebuild my house, it's simply too expensive and too painful?
Well, I think it depends. There is a general trend towards urbanisation in Australia. I mean, we are one of the most heavily urbanised populations in the world. There is also, I think, evidence that people whose homes and livelihoods were destroyed in the tragic fires in Victoria a few years ago have said, we don't want to go through that again, and have moved closer into the cities. But we're not seeing, I think, climate-forced migrations or urbanisation as such. It is true, though, that generational farming families are now rethinking. There are children who are saying, that's too hard a life, it's too risky, I can't make a living that way, I need something better for me and my children. And we are seeing changes in the traditional agricultural makeup of the Australian farming family. But these are part of a broader trend, and I don't think we should attribute it all solely to climate change.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Well, complexity is part of what makes climate change so hard to fight. And if you listen to the politicians here in Berlin, it's also what makes it so hard to bring projects like the capital's new airport to fruition on time and on budget. The debacle at Willy Brandt International is by no means an isolated example. Messy mega projects around the country are tarnishing Germany's once stellar reputation for precision engineering. But is complexity really the problem, or could it be the politicians themselves?
Right now, no one can predict when Berlin's new airport might open. Some doubt it ever will. The opening date has already been pushed back 4 times. The reason? Serious mistakes in the planning and construction of the terminal. There are major problems with the fire safety arrangements, and experts say the baggage handling system is too small. The cost overrun of more than €1 billion has left Germans shaking their heads. The political fallout so far has been moderate. Berlin's mayor, Klaus Wowereit, stepped aside as chairman of the supervisory board. His successor says they won't have to start all over again, but that parts of the construction are in need of extensive modifications.
Well, as we mentioned a moment ago, Mr. Merz, you have worked all over the world. And of course, your German engineering background is the best possible pedigree for doing so. But are there times now where you sometimes think you're going to need a second passport and identity?
Could be. Maybe down the line, if nothing changes. But as I said, I mean, when I answered your first question, you were frowning a little bit because I said I don't see a fundamental problem with German engineering, precision engineering, whatever. But I see more a problem with the way in which it is being delivered and managed. So if you go to this airport, you'll find systems that are perfectly working well and everything, but the whole system does not match up yet. And there is problems with the system. It has not been finished on time, and there is other problems. And I think there will be many more problems that come to the surface in the months to come. So we are not through with this yet.
And we're certainly not alone with this project. Let's make a brief list. We have not only the Berlin airport, we have a new concert hall in Hamburg, the Elbphilharmonie. It's already more than 3 years too late and €300 million over budget with no end in sight. And we also have the new train station in Stuttgart. It tops the scale with a couple of billion in cost overruns, billions. So the problem is endemic. What is going on?
Well, the fundamental problem, I think, is there is too much meddling on the part of the politicians. When we talk about these big projects, as you just named them, they are landmark projects, essentially. And these landmark projects, they draw a lot of interest on the part of the politicians. They are very much attached to prestige also. So every mayor wants to inaugurate a big concert hall, a big airport like this. So there's a lot of clout and push and power behind implementing these projects. But the problem is also, first of all, we have cost limitations. communities are short with money, also the states and the national government, of course. And then there is the electoral terms also. So if a politician foresees that he might not be re-elected, then of course he wants to at least get the project going before this
So
end of the term.
are you suggesting that there is systematic deception on the part of politicians underselling these projects, saying they're going to cost far less than what the politicians actually know is likely to be the end result?
There is an indication that the costs are systematically kept down to make the project fly in the beginning. And then once it's rolling, then there will be add-ons to it, because it's got to be looking a bit nicer. If you look at this passenger terminal here at BER, it was budgeted at 650 million euros. That is far from being enough. A realistic figure, and that is not an excessively expensive terminal yet, would be about 1 to 1.2 billion.
So give us a bit more detail about how that process might work. You, after all, were involved in the process at its inception. Who's in on this deception? Are they going into a dark room, the project owners, the contractor, and the politicians, and saying, well, you know, it's going to wind up costing 1.2, but let's claim it's costing 500, and then we'll get it through, and we'll worry about the rest later?
You know, you can always put the figures down on paper. But the question is, what do you implement in the end? And of course, if you go back into the mid-90s, and that is when everything took a little bit more shape through an architectural design contest, at that time still for Sperrenberg and Schönefeld site. Later in the late 90s, then there was the tender. And of course, the owners of the airport, they dreamed up what they wanted. They wanted a big, grand capital city airport. And this is what they tendered out. And the response they got, they realized they could not afford. So they aborted the process. And they said, well, we'll do a more modest airport now. And that's what they set out to do. But as they went along in the process, they kept adding on to have a nice airport because they wanted a nice airport. With a 650 million terminal of that size, you see a lot more concrete than glass. Glass is expensive, and that drives costs. So as you add those nice gadgets, let's say, you of course increase the costs. You need a change from one unit cost to another one, to a higher one. And that was obviously not done.
But clearly they assume that the project is going to be continued. In other words, that they're embarking on a process where they're going to have something that's too big to fail, so the money still has to keep on coming in.
You see, that's a trick. I mean, if it were a private company that went bust, once the money is gone, they have to really make a serious budget before they set out. But this is a political process, a public ownership. So they start out, and once the money is used up, they say, well, we are not finished. What do we do now? We cannot stop it.
But then it sounds to me like we, the taxpayers, need better advocates in the oversight committees for these projects. We've just seen the mayor of Berlin stepping down, being forced out as the head of the oversight committee for the airport, but he's been replaced by another politician. Why are politicians running these oversight committees?
In my view, they shouldn't be in there. They shouldn't have a say there. The say should be with the experts, that's technicians, and also economic people.
What do you think, Ambassador? Is this a problem that is unique to Germany, or is it a problem in democracies generally?
It's certainly not unique to Germany. I'm not sure that it uniquely afflicts democracies either. I think problems like this arise when you have a clash of agendas and you have people who perhaps say, you know what, we've changed our minds, but we don't want the change to impact on the budget. We had a very famous experience in Australia back in the 60s with the construction of the now iconic Sydney Opera House. There were disputes about design, there were accusations of meddling by politicians, the architect left the project, somebody else had to step in and finish it, the costs ran over. But would anybody say that was a failed project now? No. It's a signature of our country. It is, as I said, a world icon. And I think it's also important not to lose sight of the longer term in these sorts of projects.
Titus Chalk, certainly Britain has some eye-catching, fantastic new mega projects that it's managed to bring online. Has it figured out a better system?
No, I don't think so. I think there's just as much meddling and just as much difficulty in delivering those projects. That said, I was personally very surprised by the Olympics site for all the political wrangling that went on around that. It actually turned into a real fantastic celebration of sport and convinced the public that, you know, wow, this has been worth the investment and we will have a long-term legacy from it. So, you know, I think it's, as the ambassador says, partly whatever the pain in the inception and birth of these buildings, when you see them in use, it does tend to justify all the wrangling and difficulties in delivering them.
I know that all three of you do a great deal of traveling. How much of a difference is it going to make to you actually to have this airport postponed for yet another year? Titus, how are you feeling about it?
Well, it's I actually quite like some of the Berlin airports. I think Tegel's a really user-friendly airport, so I'm happy to keep using that. I mean, I'm not so keen on Schönefeld. I'd love this new airport to be finished, but you know, it is a little bit of a farce at this point, and it would be nice to see it wrapped up quickly so everyone could get on with enjoying Berlin's improved status in the world.
I mean, Mertz, one of the ironies is that Tegel, the old airport here in Berlin, you basically drive right up to the gate, you go in, you do your security right there at the same place you're going to fly. You're not led through endless boutiques and duty-free zones and so on to get there. But of course, that's what people want today at airports, at least the developers, right? They want actually commercial space, and the flying is incidental.
Sort of, yes. I mean, it's a big source of income. If you consider big airports, like hub airports, they generate like 60% of their revenues from retail space and commercial income. So it's a very important source of income. But as you say, they like it, but not necessarily the passenger. There is a difference. As a business passenger, if I'm traveling to a meeting like today, I want to have to spend as little time between arrival at the airport and leaving by plane, and vice versa. And I want to have short walking distances. Whereas the leisure traveler is known to spend more time at the airport, enjoy the experience of going on a longer trip, and they spend more time and more money at the airport. So even it's so that the low-cost travelers are known to spend more than others, interestingly.
Ambassador, you're probably not one of those low-cost travelers. Where's your preference? You've undoubtedly passed through some of the most glamorous of the new airports, for example, in Asia. Which are the ones that you would say, that is a successful project, that's the kind of place I would like to fly through?
Well, I have to say low cost is always a priority when you're in government service. I have travelled quite a lot in Europe and in other parts of the world. I'm a fan of Tegel, not just because in self-interested terms I can get there in about 11 minutes from my residence, but I think it is one of the best designed airports I've experienced. Of the more modern airports, I think places like Munich and Zurich have a lot to show the world. They're my preferred sort of transit points. But I certainly also agree, I go to an airport to get on a plane. If I want to go shopping, I'll go to a mall or a department store.
Thank you very much. Well, maybe the planners and politicians could learn a few things from the German Bundesliga. It is showing discipline off the pitch as well as on. Strict cost controls have turned its clubs into models of fiscal prudence, and yet they're managing to play the game with unprecedented precision, giving more profligate contenders a run for their money.
German soccer is on a winning streak. 3 German teams are currently competing in the Champions League, Europe's most prestigious competition, and 4 in the Europa League. Most German clubs are financially healthy, without the debt that plagues teams in some other countries. The fans benefit in many ways. Stadiums have been improved, ticket prices are low. And on an average match day, more people turn up to watch the Bundesliga than in Europe's other big leagues. And instead of creaming off profits, Germany is investing in youth soccer programs. Nearly $1 billion over the past decade. One result is that there is a lot of homegrown talent on the pitch. In fact, the number of domestic players is rising.
Titus Chuck, it's all very well to boast of homegrown players, but can they really compete with the very best global talent that money can buy? I'm thinking, of course, of a team like Chelsea with its top-rate foreign mercenaries, if you will, which is going to be going up against Bayern Munich this spring.
Yeah, it's a good question, but I think Germany has proved and is proving at the moment the quality of its young players. You know, they're fantastic young players coming through. I think you also have to bear in mind that there are structural changes afoot in European football. UEFA, the governing body, are trying to introduce financial fair play to control some of the spending in more laissez-faire leagues like the English Premier League, to force clubs to live within their means. And that's something that German clubs are already used to. So whereas you might see the Chelseas, the Manchester Cities of this world having to level off some of their spending, the Bundesliga is already well prepared for that, and I think will go on to enjoy a very successful time in competition if those rules are enforced.
But isn't a rich owner like Abramovich at Chelsea a blessing for a club in the end? I mean, certainly there are clubs in the Bundesliga who would love to have that kind of an owner.
Short term, certainly, but I mean, it depends how the owner injects money. If he invests money to buy new players on a loan basis and then decides to walk away from the club will be crippled by debt. It has to be in exchange for equity, and that's not always the case with these investors. We've seen high-profile cases in the English Premier League. Take it again as an example because it is so laissez-faire. When owners also use a leverage buyout, more akin to buying, a factory to buy a football club, where they load the debt that they've used to purchase the club onto previously debt-free football clubs. And that's obviously not good for the long-term health of the institution. It means money's getting siphoned off to pay banks instead of developing players.
Take us a bit through the way that the German ownership rules work. As I understand, there's a 50+1 formula. Sounds complicated. What does that mean?
It's not complicated, and it's really a very elegant part of German football culture, and really increasingly well